Hello, I'm Felicity Barr and you're at The Listening Post. This week, a new media offensive in Afghanistan. Its target, public opinion.
Day after day, the fight goes on against the Taliban.
Myanmar and the citizen journalists whose story has been turned into a documentary.
It's telling the world what's going on.
Zimbabwe opens its borders to the Western media, but what restrictions will they face? And dancing in the aisle, tying the knot YouTube style. The war in Afghanistan is now in its 8th year and public support for it in the US and UK has never been lower. So perhaps it's no surprise that as the latest offensive against the Taliban in Helmand Province continues, an equally vigorous global media campaign is unfolding. Hints that Western governments are ready to talk to the Taliban have started to appear in the headlines in London and Washington. But how are the governments of the NATO countries involved in the conflict getting their message across? And how are the Afghan media telling the story of the latest fighting with elections there fast approaching? That's our starting point this week. The media, the war, and creating a new narrative for Afghanistan.
U.S. Marines are pouring into a Taliban-infested valley. It is a
Operation Strike of the Sword, the biggest military offensive of Barack Obama's presidency, began in the
Panther's Claw is in its 4th week. It involves 4,000 UK troops in Britain's biggest single assault so far in Helmand.
Since the beginning of 2009, the war in Afghanistan has been escalating aggressively. More troops, more military equipment, and a lot more media.
Day after day, the fight goes on against the Taliban.
Just last week, Taliban militants launched one of their most audacious attacks here.
Well, I think the new Obama administration believes it's not only losing the war on the ground, it's also losing the war of words. And they've started a major reorganization of the media operation here in Afghanistan.
Western governments need to sustain this huge expenditure of money and blood they're putting into Afghanistan. They're very afraid this will be lost in a battle not in the fields of Helmand, but over public opinion.
But shaping public opinion is a complex process, especially when the news from the war front is grim.
The number of British troops seriously wounded in Afghanistan this year is already almost as high as the total for the whole of 2008.
The deadly toll continues for U.S. forces fighting on the ground in Afghanistan. 6 American soldiers died this past weekend, a bad start for August after a very bad July.
Whether or not the war is justified, whether or not ultimately there will be a breakthrough, up to now, what is there to show for all the fighting? Primarily a lot of destruction, a lot of deaths, including amongst the civilian population, and a huge amount of people who've fled. It's not a great score sheet.
And NATO spokespeople in Afghanistan are not publicising the numbers of Taliban fighters killed in battle. The message they want their audiences to hear is not one of death, but one of constructive contribution to the lives of the people of Afghanistan.
There's been a change in the language that military spokesmen are using here. They used to talk about the number of Taliban killed. Now, though, that's been banned. The new commander of US and NATO forces here says the important factor is not the number of Taliban killed, but the number of Afghan people that feel they're being protected by international forces.
I think the United States media campaign is multifaceted, including television, internet, print and radio, most importantly. I think the general themes that the United States is trying to convey are that elections are really the litmus test for political life and therefore crucial, and that war is a necessary predicate for development.
That's a tough line to push to Afghans who are caught in the middle of the crossfire. Civilian deaths have risen sharply, and it's difficult to make people believe that the fighting will have a constructive outcome. The communication challenge for the Western governments is increased by the media savvy of the Taliban.
The Taliban, when it was the government here, was an organisation that banned television. It didn't let people watch television. In the years since it became a guerrilla fighting organisation, it has used television, it's used the media pretty effectively, getting its message across to the Afghan people.
I think the Taliban leadership and their commanders are actually better at communications in almost every respect than NATO. They are very, very good at highlighting very, very rapidly any loss of civilian life.
And the Taliban media push is not limited to Afghan audiences alone. With support for the war effort sharply down in the US and UK, the Taliban are looking to grab the moment.
They know that they could actually win by outlasting the West and by destroying public support back in the West for this intervention.
And a video released by the Taliban on the 19th of July was designed to do precisely that. Footage of a captured US soldier was posted on a website by the Taliban.
To my fellow Americans who have loved ones over here,
the intention was clear. They wanted the video to go global.
You have the power to make our government bring them home. Please bring us home.
After 8 years of battle, both sides have had to temper their message. Now the war of words is moving into a new phase to try to prepare public opinion for a negotiated settlement with the Taliban.
Certainly in the past you heard messages from the Bush administration which suggested that all of the Taliban were something that should be fought and should be killed. That's changed now. You hear messages coming from Washington. The buzzword is flipping the Taliban foot soldiers, trying to take away the Taliban on the ground from the Taliban commanders who are allied with Al-Qaeda.
An inclusive political settlement in Afghanistan, which draws away conservative Pashtun nationalists, separating those who want Islamic rule locally from those committed to violent jihad globally.
And until the real talking starts, the media worldwide can expect to be used as a modern negotiating tool. And here's how our global village voices see the reporting of the war in Afghanistan.
Right now, we are seeing the Taliban engaging a war in the media, and that war apparently is working pretty well. The United States and the UK need to change and alter their plans.
The public relation war will be won using the latest technology, and that's not to do with guns and weapons. You Twitter, you use cell phone video, you use video, you get onto YouTube, MySpace, Facebook, get it out on the internet. So if you want to do something, what you do is every village should have internet connections. This is for their own protection.
If you look at what's taking place in the United Kingdom in reference to the war and in the United States, you would think there are two different wars going on. And here's the essence of it. The British media is aggressively covering the accelerated war in Afghanistan that's taking place right now, whereas the American news media is primarily silent about that war. And here's the reason why they're silent about it. They're silent about it because the American news media is in the hip pocket of this present administration.
And anyone looking to be one of our global village voices can either email us at listeningpost@aljazeera.net or just go onto Facebook and look for the Listening Post page. You can also follow us on Twitter. We'll let you know via Facebook and Twitter what stories we're working on and how you can take part in the programme. Time now for Listening Post Newsbites. And Iraq is among the most dangerous places on earth to work as a journalist, so you'd think that a new law designed to protect them would be a good thing. However, it's not that simple. The new draft law will see journalists and their families provided with grants of up to $2,400 should they be killed or injured on the job. It'll also ensure that they are never forced into publishing material they're not comfortable with. However, what has media watchers on guard is a section of the law which says journalists must not use the media to threaten citizens or, quote, compromise the security and stability of the country, unquote. Baghdad-based media watchdog Journalistic Freedom Observatory is worried the new legislation will be used by the government to limit press freedom and not to protect journalists. Now, when Zimbabwe's unity government came to power earlier this year, the country was in a media lockdown. People were sceptical that change would come anytime soon. But now it seems like the government's grip on the media is loosening.
Small signs of progress in Zimbabwe as the country rebuilds. The BBC resumes broadcasting.
For the first time in 8 years, the BBC has been allowed to resume reporting from inside the country. The government has also told CNN that they can reopen their bureau in Harare. For many media observers, though, the real litmus test of reform was to be the government's handling of local media. The lifting of the ban on a leading private newspaper, Daily News, has been seen as a significant step towards rejuvenating Zimbabwe's media landscape. Now what remains to be seen is whether or not those newly reopened news outlets will be allowed to do their jobs without government interference. The media is once again at the centre of controversy in Venezuela, in a move that some media rights activists are calling the most important curb of freedom of expression ever seen in Venezuela. 32 radio and 2 TV stations have been ordered to stop broadcasting immediately. Many of the stations are anti-President Hugo Chavez, but as ever with Venezuela, there is another side to the story. The government has said the stations were breaking national telecom laws since they were operating without valid broadcast permits, some of them for 30 years. Not everyone is convinced by this explanation, however. Reporters Without Borders has argued that the stations were taken off the air because of their opposition to the president. For their part, the government cited 450 other radio stations that continue to operate in the country despite their opposition to President Chavez. The Venezuelan government is currently preparing to introduce a new media law, which they say will prevent hate speak, but which human rights groups say will severely restrict free reporting. The retrial over the killing of the investigative journalist and staunch critic of the Kremlin, Anna Politkovskaya, has reopened in Moscow. She was shot dead in the elevator of her apartment building in 2006 in what appeared to be a professional hit. In February this year, a Russian court acquitted 3 men accused of being involved in Politkovskaya's murder. But Russian journalists and human rights groups were highly critical of the process of that trial. Russia's Supreme Court ordered the retrial, citing procedural violations. However, none of the men on trial are suspected of actually pulling the trigger. The suspected gunman is still at large. According to the International Federation of Journalists, more than 150 journalists have been murdered in the country since 1993. But the climate of impunity persists in Russia, with very few of those cases going to trial and even fewer resulting in convictions. Now, President Obama shares his birthday with the doyen of the Washington Press Corps, Helen Thomas. He turned 48, she is now 89. He made a surprise visit to the White House press room to give her cupcakes and candles.
Well, you got to blow it out to make it come true.
Under the Bush administration, Ms. Thomas was hardly called to give a single question at press conferences. When President Obama took office, he made a show of taking an early question from her. But since then, nothing. Some observers say he didn't like the tough questions she threw at him. Maybe the cakes were by way of a peace offering. We're back after the break with a report on the citizen journalists of Myanmar.